The morning sun cast long shadows across Central Park's east entrance as Harold Jenkins adjusted his worn tie. His weathered hands smoothed down the front of his faded but clean dress shirt, a daily ritual that hadn't changed in the 8 years since his retirement as a paramedic. "Morning, Mr. Jenkins." Tommy, the hot dog vendor, called out as Harold passed by. "Same spot today." "Same as always, Tommy." Harold's voice carried the slight roughness of age, but maintained its warmth. He patted the small medical kit attached to his belt, another unchanging part of his daily routine. The regulars knew him by now. The morning joggers, the early dog walkers, the parents rushing their kids to school, they'd all grown used to seeing the tall, dignified black man in his press clothes, making his rounds through the park. What they didn't know was why he carried that medical kit everywhere, or why he'd been coming here every day for the past 3 years. Harold settled onto his usual bench, the one with the best view of the playground and picnic area. He pulled out his logbook, a simple notebook where he tracked the park's daily activities. The pages were filled with neat handwriting noting weather conditions, number of visitors, and any medical incidents he'd assisted with. "Daddy, catch me?" A little girl's voice caught his attention. Harold's hand tightened on his pen as memories flooded back. 20 years earlier, "Daddy, catch me," Lisa had called out, her braids bouncing as she ran across this same park. She was 7 then, full of life despite her asthma. Harold had always carried her inhaler, always kept it within reach. But that day, Harold shook his head, forcing himself back to the present. His hand automatically touched the spare inhaler in his medical kit, the one he'd started carrying after Lisa's death. He'd helped 16 kids with asthma attacks in this park over the past 3 years. 16 times he'd prevented other parents from experiencing what he had. The morning crowd started to thin as lunchtime approached. Harold noticed a new face entering the park, a man in an expensive suit, leading a young girl by the hand. The man's posture screamed money and importance, from his perfectly tailored jacket to his designer shoes. "Sarah, remember what we discussed about your posture," the man said, his voice carrying across the quiet park. A chin always presents themselves with dignity. The girl, Sarah, straightened her shoulders, but Harold could see the slight wheeze in her breathing even from a distance. His trained eye caught the subtle signs, the slight pulling at her neck muscles, the barely noticeable pause between steps. "Yes, father," Sarah replied, her voice small but clear. Harold watched as the man, presumably Mr. Chun, led his daughter toward the benches near the fountain. As they passed Harold's bench, Chin's lip curled slightly at the sight of Harold's worn clothing. "Come along, Sarah. Let's find a more suitable spot," Chin said, steering his daughter away. Harold remained still, his expression unchanged. He'd seen that look countless times before, the quick dismissal, the automatic assumption. But his focus wasn't on Chin's reaction. It was on Sarah's breathing pattern, which was becoming increasingly labored in the autumn air. He opened his logbook again, making a quick note. 11:47 a.m., young girl, approximately 12, showing signs of respiratory distress. Father present. Monitor situation. The sound of Sarah's cough echoed across the park, and Harold's muscles tensed. He'd heard that kind of cough before, the kind that preceded trouble. His hand moved to his medical kit, unsnapping the clasp, as he watched him pull out what appeared to be an inhaler from his daughter's pink backpack. Sarah's next cough was deeper, more desperate. Harold stood up slowly, his eyes fixed on the scene unfolding 50 feet away. He saw Chin shake the inhaler, saw the flash of panic cross his face as he realized it was empty. "Sarah?" Chin's voice carried a note of fear now. "Sarah, breathe slowly." Harold took a step forward, then another. 20 years of experience told him what was coming next. He watched as Sarah's hands began to tremble, as her shoulders hunched forward in that all-too-familiar way. And then he heard it, the distinctive wheeze of an airway closing up. "Help!" Chin's voice cracked with desperation. "Somebody help! My daughter can't breathe." Harold was already moving, his worn shoes carrying him swiftly across the park grass, medical kit in hand. Behind him, he could hear Tommy calling 911, but Harold knew that sometimes seconds meant everything. He learned that lesson the hard way 20 years ago with Lisa. Robert Chun had planned this walk perfectly. Lunch hour was ideal. Fewer people meant fewer distractions, and he needed Sarah to focus on their conversation about her future. The quarterly reports could wait. This was about ensuring his daughter understood the weight of the Chin family name. The entrance exam for Preston Academy is in 3 months, Robert said, guiding Sarah along the park path. He'd chosen this park specifically for its proximity to the school. Your grandfather attended Preston, as did I. It's tradition. Sarah nodded, her ponytail bobbing slightly. I've been studying every night, Father. Robert noticed her voice sounded thinner than usual, but pressed on. These moments were crucial for her development. Good. But remember, a Chin doesn't just pass, we excel. Speaking of which, how was your piano recital practice yesterday? Mrs. Harrison says I'm. Sarah paused, taking a shallow breath. Ready for the winter showcase? They passed a bench where an older black man sat watching them. Robert frowned at the man's worn clothing. This part of the park usually attracted a better class of people. He steered Sarah away, noting with disapproval how the stranger seemed to be watching them. Let's discuss your schedule, Robert continued, pulling out his phone. I've arranged for additional mathematics tutoring on Thursdays. That leaves Monday and Wednesday for piano, Tuesday for Chinese lessons, and... Father. Sarah's voice wavered. Robert looked up from his phone. Sarah's face had paled, and her breathing seemed faster than normal. What is it? My chest. She coughed, and the sound was wrong, tight and wheezing. Where's your inhaler? Robert reached for her backpack, maintaining his composure. He'd dealt with her asthma attacks before. It was simply a matter of proper medication and staying calm. Sarah's next breath came with a frightening whistle. In the front pocket, Robert's fingers found the inhaler, but something was wrong. He shook it empty. How was it empty? He'd just replaced it last. No, that had been 3 weeks ago. He'd meant to get a refill, but the merger negotiations had consumed his attention. Sarah? His voice cracked as she hunched forward, her shoulders heaving. Sarah, breathe slowly, like Dr. Matthews showed you. But Sarah's next breath was worse, a desperate gasp that seemed to provide no air at all. Her hands clutched at her chest, and her eyes widened with panic. Help! The word burst from Robert's throat before he could stop it. Somebody help! My daughter can't breathe. He heard running footsteps behind him and turned to see the man from the bench approaching rapidly. Robert's first instinct was to wave him away. What could this shabbily dressed stranger do? But Sarah's next gasping breath shattered his hesitation. Please, Robert said, the word foreign on his tongue. She can't breathe. The man moved with surprising authority, kneeling beside Sarah. His hands were steady as he opened a worn medical kit. My name is Harold Jenkins. I'm a retired paramedic. Sarah, can you hear me? Sarah managed a slight nod, her fingers now gripping Robert's sleeve. Good girl. I'm going to help you breathe. Okay. Harold's voice was calm, professional. He pulled out an inhaler, new, sealed in its package. Mr. Chun, I need you to help her sit up straight. Support her back. Robert found himself obeying without question, his arms wrapping around his daughter. Her body shook with each attempted breath. Hold on, sweetheart, Robert whispered, his carefully maintained composure crumbling as he watched Harold prepare the inhaler. Just hold on. Harold's weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency, his actions smooth and confident. Sarah, when I count to 3, I want you to try to take a slow breath in. Can you do that for me? Sarah's grip on Robert's sleeve tightened. A small nod. Good. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Robert watched as Harold brought the inhaler to Sarah's lips. His daughter's next breath sounded like sandpaper on wood, and Robert felt tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. Please, he whispered again, this time not to Harold, but to whatever power might be listening. Please. Harold's free hand rested on Sarah's shoulder, steady and reassuring. That's it, just like that. Another breath when you're ready. Robert could feel his daughter trembling against him, could hear the desperate fight for each breath. In that moment, all his plans, his expectations, his carefully constructed world of business deals and social status meant nothing. His little girl couldn't breathe, and he, with all his money and influence, could do nothing but watch as a stranger in worn clothes fought to save her life. Dad! Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. I'm scared. Robert's throat tightened. The last time she'd called him Dad instead of Father was 3 years ago, when she'd broken her arm falling from her bicycle. I'm here, baby, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Mr. Jenkins is going to help you. Just focus on breathing. A small crowd had begun to gather at a respectful distance. Robert could hear sirens in the distance, but they seemed far away, unimportant. His entire world had narrowed to the sound of his daughter's breathing and the steady movements of Harold Jenkins' hands. Harold's hands remained steady as he administered the second puff from the inhaler, but his mind raced back 20 years. Different park, different child, same desperate sounds of struggling breath. Sarah, you're doing great, he said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had served him through countless emergencies. Just like before, slow breath, and when I count to 3, Robert Chun hovered close, his expensive suit wrinkled where Sarah gripped it. The transformation in the man was stark. Gone was the dismissive businessman from minutes earlier, replaced by a father stripped of all pretense by fear. 1, 2, 3. Harold counted, watching Sarah's chest rise with effort. A crowd had gathered, but Tommy the hot dog vendor kept them back. Give them space, folks. EMTs are on their way. The ambulance, Robert started to say, but Harold cut him off with a gentle head shake. Right now, Sarah needs to focus only on breathing, Harold explained. Talk to her calmly. Help her stay relaxed. Robert swallowed hard and nodded. You're doing so well, Sarah. Just listen to Mr. Jenkins. Sarah's next breath came slightly easier, but Harold knew better than to relax. He'd seen too many asthma attacks surge back stronger after a momentary improvement. His fingers moved to Sarah's wrist, checking her pulse while watching her chest movement. How? Robert's voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. How did you know to bring an inhaler? Harold kept his eyes on Sarah as he answered. I always carry one, along with epinephrine, basic first aid supplies, and a few other essentials. He didn't add why. This wasn't the moment for that story. Sarah's breathing hitched, and Harold immediately refocused. Another puff, Sarah. Ready? 1, 2, 3. The medication hissed into her lungs. Harold watched her face intently, noting the slight reduction in the pulling around her neck muscles. Good sign, but not enough yet. Mr. Jenkins, Sarah managed between breaths. Thank you. Save your breath for breathing, young lady, Harold said gently. We can talk later? The wail of approaching sirens grew louder. Harold could feel Robert Chen's questioning gaze on him, probably wondering why a retired paramedic spent his days in the park wearing old clothes. But the man said nothing, his attention returning to his daughter. The medicine, Robert began. I should have checked. I always check, but the merger... He stopped, shame crossing his features. Harold kept his voice neutral. Asthma attacks can happen even with a full inhaler, Mr. Chun. What matters is how we handle them. Sarah's breathing was becoming more regular now, though still labored. Harold maintained his grip on the inhaler, ready for another dose if needed. The sunlight caught the tears on the girl's cheeks, and for a moment, Harold saw Lisa's face superimposed over hers. The ambulance pulled up to the park entrance, its lights flashing against the autumn leaves. 2 EMTs hurried across the grass with their equipment. Harold Jenkins? The first EMT, a young woman, recognized him. Should have known you'd be here. Jessica, Harold nodded. Moderate to severe asthma attack. 3 doses of albuterol administered over the past 8 minutes. Pulse elevated but steady. Breathing improving but still labored. Jessica nodded, kneeling beside Sarah. Thanks, Harold. We'll take it from here. She turned to Robert. Sir, we'd like to transport her to Presbyterian for observation. Standard procedure with an attack this severe? Robert nodded quickly. Yes, of course. Whatever she needs. He looked at Harold. Mr. Jenkins, Go with your daughter, Harold said firmly. She needs you. As the EMTs helped Sarah onto the stretcher, Harold began repacking his medical kit. His hands moved automatically through the familiar routine. Checking supplies, noting what needed replacement, restoring order. Mr. Jenkins? Sarah's voice was weak but clearer. Will you be here tomorrow? Harold looked up, meeting her eyes. Same bench, same time. Robert Chin stood frozen for a moment, looking between his daughter on the stretcher and the elderly man in worn clothes who had saved her. His mouth opened as if to speak, then closed again. "The hospital, sir?" Jessica prompted gently. Robert nodded and turned to follow the stretcher, but not before giving Harold one last look, one that carried the weight of countless unspoken words. Harold watched them leave, his hand absently touching the small photo he kept in his medical kit. Once the ambulance pulled away, he returned to his bench, pulled out his logbook, and made a simple entry. 12:17 p.m. Assisted young girl, Sarah Chun, with severe asthma attack. Response good. Transport to Presbyterian. The gathered crowd slowly dispersed. Tommy walked over with a cup of coffee. "On the house, Mr. Jenkins," he said, placing it on the bench. Harold nodded his thanks, his eyes still on the park entrance where the ambulance had been. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees, carrying away the last echoes of sirens, but Harold remained seated. He had a feeling his job here wasn't finished yet. In his pocket, the spare inhaler he always carried seemed to weigh a little lighter now. One more child who would make it home today. One more parent who wouldn't have to live with the weight he'd carried for 20 years. The coffee grew cold beside him as he waited, watching the shadows lengthen across the park grass. Some days, he knew, the ghosts of the past could lead to salvation in the present. Today had been one of those days. The emergency room lights cast harsh shadows across Robert Chin's face as he sat beside Sarah's hospital bed. The steady beeping of the heart monitor had become a reassuring rhythm over the past hour, marking each moment his daughter continued to breathe. "Vitals are looking good," Dr. Matthews said, reviewing the charts. The quick response in the park probably prevented a much more serious situation. Sarah lay back against the pillows, her color much improved but her body still showing the exhaustion of the attack. An oxygen sensor glowed softly on her finger, its numbers strong and steady. "Mr. Jenkins," Sarah said softly, her voice clearer now. He knew exactly what to do. Robert nodded, his hand tightening around hers. The image of the elderly man in his worn but dignified clothes wouldn't leave his mind. The steady hands, the calm voice, the absolute certainty of his actions. It had been like watching a master craftsman at work. "Dad!" Sarah's voice drew him back to the present. She was still calling him Dad instead of Father, a change that now seemed significant. "Can we thank him? Tomorrow?" Before Robert could answer, a knock at the door drew their attention. A nurse entered, followed by a familiar figure, Harold Jenkins, still in his pressed but worn clothes, medical kit at his belt. "Hope I'm not intruding," Harold said, standing just inside the doorway. "Thought I'd check on my patient." "Mr. Jenkins." Sarah's face brightened. "Please come in." Robert stood, extending his hand. "Mr. Jenkins, He stopped, overwhelmed by the inadequacy of words. Harold stepped forward, accepting the handshake. His grip was firm, his weathered hand warm and steady. "How's the breathing, Sarah?" "Much better," she replied. "Dr. Matthews says I can go home tomorrow morning." Harold moved to the bedside, his experienced eyes scanning the monitors. "Good numbers," he noted. "You handled that attack like a champion." "Thanks to you," Robert said. "If you hadn't been there..." "But I was," Harold cut in gently. And Sarah did the hard part, staying calm and following instructions. Dr. Matthews cleared his throat. "Mr. Jenkins, I understand you're a retired paramedic?" Harold nodded. 32 years with the city. Retired 8 years ago. "Your intervention was textbook perfect," the doctor said. "The timing of the albuterol doses, the positioning, the way you kept her calm. You probably prevented an intubation." Robert watched as Harold accepted the praise with a slight nod, noting how the man's hand unconsciously touched his medical kit. There was a story there, he was sure of it. "Mr. Jenkins," Sarah said, "why do you carry an inhaler?" "In the park." The room grew quiet. Harold's face remained composed, but something flickered in his eyes, an old pain quickly masked. "Sarah," Robert started, sensing the weight of the question, but Harold held up a hand. "It's all right," he said. His voice was steady, but carried a depth that hadn't been there before. "I carry it because 20 years ago, I learned the hard way that you never know when someone might need help breathing." Sarah's monitors beeped steadily in the silence that followed. Robert found himself holding his breath, recognizing the edge of a deeper story. "My daughter, Lisa," Harold continued, his eyes focused on the window beyond Sarah's bed. "She was 7. We were at the park, different park, same city. Beautiful autumn day, just like today." Robert felt his chest tighten as understanding began to dawn. "She had asthma too," Harold said. "Always carried her inhaler. But that day was empty, and I didn't have a spare." His hand gripped the medical kit. "The ambulance took 12 minutes to arrive." "Oh, Mr. Jenkins," Sarah whispered, tears welling in her eyes. After that, Harold's voice remained steady. Though his knuckles were white on the medical kit, I made sure I'd never watch another child struggle to breathe without being able to help. Started carrying supplies. Kept up my certifications even after retirement. Found that park bench. Robert Chun, who prided himself on always knowing what to say in any situation, found himself speechless. The memory of his earlier dismissal of Harold struck him like a physical blow. 16 kids, Harold continued. "That's how many I've helped in that park over the last 3 years. 17 now, counting you, Sarah." A small smile touched his lips. "Each one of them got to go home, breathing easy." Dr. Matthews wiped at his eyes, trying to maintain professional composure. The nurse had stopped pretending to check the 4, listening openly now. "Mr. Jenkins," Robert finally managed, his voice rough. "How can I ever?" "Don't." Harold's voice was firm, but kind. "Just make sure her inhaler's always full from now on. And maybe—" He paused, seeming to consider his next words carefully. "Maybe remember that sometimes the most important things in life don't come with a price tag." Sarah reached out and took Harold's hand. "Will you still be at your bench tomorrow?" "Every day," Harold replied. "Rain or shine. Some habits you don't want to break." Robert watched as his daughter squeezed the old man's hand, saw the gentle way Harold patted her shoulder. The businessman in him wanted to pull out his checkbook, make some grand gesture, but he understood now that would be missing the point entirely. "Mr. Jenkins," he said instead, "would you join us for dinner once Sarah's released? I think we'd like to hear more about Lisa, if you're willing to share." Harold's eyes met Robert's, and for a moment, the masks both men wore, the wealthy businessman, the humble retiree, fell away, leaving just 2 fathers who understood the terror of watching their child fight for breath. "I'd like that," Harold said simply. The monitors continued their steady beeping, marking the rhythm of Sarah's breathing, of second chances, of lessons learned on an autumn afternoon in a city park. Outside the window, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple, while inside, something new was beginning to take shape, something that had started with a desperate cry for help in an old man's well-worn medical kit. The following afternoon, Central Park hummed with its usual activity. Harold sat on his bench, logbook open, when he spotted Robert Chin approaching. The businessman had traded his suit for casual slacks and a sweater, looking almost unrecognizable from the day before. "Mr. Jenkins," Robert stopped a few feet away. "May I join you?" Harold gestured to the empty space beside him. "How's Sarah?" "Home now. Resting." Robert sat, his posture stiff. She wanted to come, but her mother insisted on a day of complete rest. A jogger passed by, nodding to Harold. "Morning, Mr. Jenkins. You seem to know everyone here," Robert observed. 3 years on this bench, you get to know the regulars." Harold closed his logbook. "Though some people I'd rather not have met under emergency circumstances." Robert winced. "About yesterday, the way I acted when we first—" "Water under the bridge, Mr. Chun." "Robert, please." He pulled an envelope from his pocket. "I know you'll probably refuse this, but I have to try." Harold didn't even look at the envelope. "You're right. I will refuse. Please, I insist. What you did for Sarah wasn't for sale." Harold's voice remained gentle but firm. "Put it away, Robert." Robert slowly returned the envelope to his pocket. "Then tell me how I can thank you." Harold watched a young mother pushing a stroller, his mind drifting to memories of Lisa. "Tell me about Sarah. How long has she had asthma?" "Diagnosed at 5. Robert's shoulders relaxed slightly. "It's been challenging, balancing her health with everything else we want for her." "Everything you want for her," Harold corrected quietly. Robert turned sharply, then deflated. "You're very direct, Mr. Jenkins." "Harold." "And yes, 32 years of emergency response teaches you not to waste time dancing around the point." A silence fell between them, broken only by the distant laughter of children at the playground. Robert fidgeted with his watch, a habit Harold had noticed yesterday. "I push her too hard," Robert finally admitted. "Piano, academics, Chinese lessons. I'm so focused on her future that sometimes I forget about her present." "Yesterday was her present," Harold said, "and all the money in the world couldn't buy her the one thing she needed most. Air." Robert's voice cracked. "Such a simple thing. We take it for granted until we can't." Harold opened his medical kit, pulling out the small photo he carried. This was Lisa, 2 weeks before she died. Robert accepted the worn photograph. A smiling black girl with braids looked back at him, her arms wrapped around a younger Harold's neck. Both beamed at the camera. "She's beautiful," Robert said softly. "She wanted to be a doctor." Harold's voice carried old pain. "Used to practice with her toy medical kit. The irony doesn't escape me." Robert handed the photo back carefully. "Does it get easier? The memories?" "No." Harold tucked the photo away. "But they can become fuel instead of fire. Each child I help breathe is a tribute to her." A police officer walked by, touching his hat. "Afternoon, Mr. Jenkins. All quiet today." "So far, Officer Martinez. How's your daughter's inhaler working out?" "Perfect. That technique you showed her really helps." After the officer passed, Robert asked, "How many people in this park know about what you do?" "Most of the regulars." Harold gestured to his medical kit. "They know to find me if there's trouble. Some bring their kids by just to learn proper inhaler technique. A one-man emergency response system. More like a neighbor looking out for neighbors." Harold checked his watch. "Speaking of which, it's about time for the school children to cut through the park. That's when most incidents happen." Robert stood, brushing off his slacks. "I should let you get back to your watch." "But Harold, would you consider sharing your knowledge more formally?" Harold raised an eyebrow. "The way you handled Sarah's attack, it was more than just medical training. It was experience, instinct. There must be others who could benefit from that knowledge." "I'm just one old man on a park bench, Robert, who saved 17 children." Robert's business instincts began to surface, but differently now. "Imagine how many more could be saved if others knew what you know." Harold's hand touched his medical kit. "What are you suggesting?" "I don't know yet, but I'd like to explore the possibility." "With your permission." A young girl ran past, her breathing slightly labored from exercise. Harold's eyes tracked her automatically, assessing, before returning to Robert. "Let me think about it," Harold said finally. "Meanwhile, you think about what Sarah wants. Not just what you want for her." Robert nodded slowly. "Will you still come to dinner?" "Sarah made me promise to ask again." "Tomorrow night?" 7 o'clock. Robert handed him a business card with an address pinned on the back. "No suits required." Harold smiled slightly. "Wouldn't have one even if they were." As Robert walked away, Harold reopened his logbook. Under yesterday's entry about Sarah, he added a note. "Father visited." Beginning to understand. The afternoon sun warmed the bench as Harold resumed his watch. In his mind, he could hear Lisa's voice. "You're helping, Daddy. You're helping them breathe." Yes, he thought. One breath at a time. The Chun residence stood imposing against the darkening sky. Harold adjusted his collar as he approached the front door, medical kit still at his side. Some habits didn't stop for dinner invitations. Sarah opened the door before he could knock. "Mr. Jenkins, you came. Said I would, didn't I?" Harold smiled at her evident recovery. Her breathing sounded clear and strong. "Sarah, let Mr. Jenkins come inside," Anachin called from within. Robert's wife appeared in the foyer, elegant but warm. "Please come in. We're so grateful you could join us." The interior matched the exterior's grandeur, but Harold noticed touches of real life among the luxury. Sarah's school books scattered on a side table, family photos mixed with expensive art. "Harold," Robert emerged from what appeared to be a home office. "I'm glad you made it. Sarah's been talking about your visit all day. Dad's been different since the park," Sarah whispered as she led Harold to the dining room. "Less dad-like?" Harold caught Robert's slight wince at his daughter's words. "Good." Awareness was the first step to change. "Mr. Jenkins," Anna said as they settled at the table, I don't know how to thank you for what you did. Your daughter's breathing fine. That's all the thanks I need. Dinner progressed naturally, the initial formality giving way to comfortable conversation. Sarah dominated much of it, eager to share stories about school and her interests. Harold noticed how Robert seemed to be truly listening to her for perhaps the first time. So you really want to study marine biology? Robert asked, something like surprise in his voice. Since forever, Sarah replied. I told you last year, but... She trailed off. But I was too focused on Preston Academy and following the Chun family tradition. Robert finished quietly. I remember now. I just wasn't hearing you then. Anna reached over and squeezed her husband's hand. Speaking of hearing people, Robert said, turning to Harold, I've been thinking about our conversation in the park. Harold set down his fork. Have you now? What conversation? Sarah asked. Robert leaned forward. Harold, what would you say if I proposed funding a program to put emergency inhalers in every public school in the district? The table fell silent. Harold's hand automatically touched his medical kit. Every school, he asked carefully. With proper training for staff, of course. That's where you'd come in, if you're willing. Robert's eyes held a new kind of intensity, not the sharp business focus from the park, but something more personal. Your experience, your techniques, they shouldn't be limited to one park bench. Sarah's eyes widened. You could teach people what you taught me? How to stay calm? How to breathe properly? It's not that simple, Harold said. Training, liability issues, coordination with school nurses. I've spent all day researching it. Robert cut in. The legal framework exists. Several cities have similar programs, but nothing with the comprehensive training component I'm envisioning. Nothing with someone like you at its heart. Robert, Anna said softly. Let him process. Harold stared at his plate, seeing Lisa's face reflected in the polished silver. Why? Why what? Why do this? It's not a profitable venture. No return on investment. Robert set his napkin down deliberately. 2 days ago, I watched my daughter fighting for breath, and I was helpless. All my money, all my connections meant nothing. But you. He gestured at Harold's worn clothes, his medical kit. You save her with nothing but knowledge, experience, and a spare inhaler. Dad, Sarah whispered. No, let me finish. Robert's voice grew stronger. I've spent my life building wealth, measuring success in dollars and cents. But in that park, I learned that the most valuable things can't be bought. They have to be given freely, like you've been doing every day for 3 years. Harold looked up, meeting Robert's gaze. Lisa wanted to be a doctor. Did I tell you that? Yes, in the park. She never got the chance. But maybe... Harold touched his medical kit again. Maybe this is a way to honor that dream. To help other children breathe. Even when I can't be there personally. Is that a yes? Sarah asked eagerly. It's a tell me more, Harold replied. Starting with how you plan to implement this. Robert pulled out his phone, fingers flying over the screen. I've already drafted a preliminary proposal. We'd start with a pilot program in 5 schools, focusing on areas with higher asthma rates. You develop the training curriculum based on your experience. We'd provide emergency inhalers, spacers, and basic monitoring equipment to each school. Cost? Harold asked. I'm prepared to commit $5 million initially. Harold almost choked on his water. $5 million? This isn't about money, Harold. It's about making sure no parent has to watch their child gasp for breath while waiting for help to arrive. Robert's voice softened. It's about making sure what happened to Lisa doesn't happen to another child. Sarah reached across the table and took Harold's hand. Please say yes, Mr. Jenkins. You could help so many kids. Harold looked at his medical kit, thinking of the 17 children he'd helped in the park. 17 successes, but how many others had he missed? How many schools had no one trained to handle an asthma emergency? I have conditions, he said finally. Robert straightened. Name them. The program remains free for all schools. No means testing, no special requirements. Agreed. Training includes all staff, not just nurses. Teachers, coaches, cafeteria workers, anyone who might be present during an attack. Of course. And Harold paused, making sure he had Robert's full attention. We include a component about listening to the children themselves, about recognizing when they're trying to tell us something's wrong, even if it doesn't fit our plans for them. Robert's eyes flickered to Sarah, then back to Harold. That's non-negotiable. Then we have a starting point. Harold extended his hand across the table. Partner. As they shook hands, Harold saw tears in Anna's eyes. Sarah was beaming, and even Robert's usual composed expression had cracked into a genuine smile. Lisa would be proud, Mr. Jenkins, Sarah said quietly. Harold nodded, unable to speak for a moment. In his mind, he could see her, 7 years old, clutching her toy medical kit, saying she wanted to help people breathe better. Yes, he said finally. I believe she would. Roosevelt Middle School's gymnasium buzzed with anticipation. Teachers, administrative staff, and maintenance workers filled the bleachers. All eyes focused on the unlikely pair standing at center court. Harold Jenkins in his pressed but worn clothes, and Robert Chun in a casual button-down shirt. The most important thing to remember, Harold's voice carried clear and strong, is that time is critical during an asthma attack. Every second spent searching for medication is a second a child struggles to breathe. He held up one of the bright red emergency kits they designed. These will be mounted in high-visibility locations throughout your school. Each contains 2 rescue inhalers, spacers, and step-by-step instructions. A teacher raised her hand. What if we're not sure it's an asthma attack? Good question. Harold opened one of the kits. If a child is having difficulty breathing, treating for asthma won't harm them, but failing to treat an actual asthma attack could be fatal. When in doubt, act. Robert watched from the side as Harold demonstrated proper inhaler technique. The transformation in the old paramedic was remarkable. The quiet dignity he'd shown in the park had evolved into commanding presence. Now, let's practice with the training inhalers, Harold announced. Remember, stay calm. Your confidence helps keep the child calm. As the staff paired up for practice, Robert's phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. How's it going? He smiled, typing back. Harold's a natural teacher. First school, almost trained. Sarah's response came quickly. Tell him I practiced my breathing exercises this morning. The pride in her message was clear. Since the dinner 2 months ago, Sarah had become the program's unofficial youth ambassador, speaking to other students about asthma awareness. Mr. Chin? A school administrator approached. The news crew is here. Robert nodded. They'd agreed to limited media coverage, focusing on the program rather than personal stories. Harold had been clear about that. No exploiting Lisa's memory for publicity. The reporter set up quietly at the back of the gym, filming Harold as he moved among the staff pairs, correcting technique here, offering encouragement there. Remember, Harold was saying, children often try to hide their symptoms, especially if they're afraid of disrupting class. Learn to recognize the early signs. Unusual quietness, tired appearance, slight cough. A maintenance worker raised his hand. Like Sarah Chin that day in the park? The gym fell silent. Everyone knew the story by now. It had spread through the school system, though never through official channels. Harold's hand stilled on the inhaler he was demonstrating. Yes, exactly like that. He paused, then continued with renewed intensity. Which is why we're all here today. Because next time, it might be one of your students. And now you'll be ready. The training continued for another hour. Robert watched as the staff's initial uncertainty transformed into confident movements, sure hands practicing with the training inhalers. Good, Maria, Harold praised a cafeteria worker. Nice, steady technique. The child would feel very safe with you. Finally, Harold called everyone together. You've all done excellently. Remember, these kits aren't just pieces of equipment. They're lifelines. Each one represents our promise to protect the children in our care. The principal stepped forward. Thank you, Mr. Jenkins, Mr. Chun. We're honored to be the first school in the program. As the staff began to disperse, the reporter approached. Mr. Chun, could we get a quick statement about the program? Robert glanced at Harold, who nodded slightly. The Breath of Life program is about empowering school staff to handle respiratory emergencies, Robert said. Every child deserves to feel safe at school, and every parent deserves to know their child will be cared for in an emergency. And Mr. Jenkins? The reporter turned to Harold. What inspired you to develop the training program? Harold's hand touched his medical kit, a gesture Robert now recognized as connecting with Lisa's memory. Experience taught me that knowledge saves lives. Now we're sharing that knowledge. After the reporter left, Robert and Harold walked through the school halls, watching as maintenance crews mounted the red emergency kits at strategic locations. 5 schools done by next week, Robert said. The superintendent's already asking about expanding to the whole district. Harold stopped at one of the mounted kits, checking its placement. Higher, he told the worker. It needs to be visible from both directions. Harold? Robert waited until the old paramedic turned to him. Thank you. Not just for Sarah, but for all of this. Don't thank me yet. Harold's eyes held a familiar intensity. We got 19 more schools to train this month alone. They reached the school entrance, where Sarah waited in the car with Anna. She waved excitedly through the window. Mr. Jenkins, she called out. Did they do good? Did they learn everything? Harold smiled. They did great. Your school's going to be ready next week. Dad says you're amazing at teaching. Sarah's eyes shone. Just like with me in the park. Speaking of the park, Robert said, you haven't been there much lately. Tommy keeps my bench warm, Harold replied. This is more important right now. They watched as another emergency kit was mounted by the school entrance, its red case bright against the pale walls. Lisa would have been an excellent doctor, Robert said quietly. Harold nodded, his hand resting on the kit. She is helping people breathe better. Just not quite the way we planned. Sarah got out of the car and hugged Harold impulsively. See you at the next school tomorrow? Wouldn't miss it. Harold's voice was gruff with emotion. Got a lot more people to teach about breathing. As they drove away, Robert watched in the rearview mirror as Harold stood by the school entrance, his hand still touching the emergency kit. The old paramedic's figure seemed somehow larger now, as if the weight of his past had transformed into the strength of his purpose. Dad? Sarah's voice came from the back seat. I think Mr. Jenkins is the richest person I know. Robert caught his daughter's eyes in the mirror. How so? Because he turns sad things into helping things. That's worth more than money, right? Yes, Robert said softly, thinking of how a chance encounter in the park had changed so many lives. Yes, it is. 6 months after the park incident, Harold Jenkins sat on his familiar bench, logbook open on his lap. Spring had arrived, painting Central Park in fresh greens and early blooms his medical kit. Though still present at his side, had company now, a stack of training manuals for the next week's school sessions. Morning, Mr. Jenkins. Tommy called from his hot dog stand. Saw you on the news again yesterday. Harold nodded, slightly uncomfortable with the attention the program had been receiving. 30 schools now had emergency inhalers and trained staff. The local media had dubbed him the Breathing Man, a title that made him cringe every time he heard it. Mr. Jenkins, a familiar voice called out. Sarah Chin jogged toward his bench, her breathing steady and controlled. Robert followed at a more sedate pace. Shouldn't you be in school? Harold checked his watch. Half day, Sarah explained, sitting beside him. Teacher training. She grinned. Guess who's doing it? Harold smiled. The program had evolved beyond his initial training sessions. Now successfully trained schools were helping prepare other schools in their districts. The ripple effect had exceeded even Robert's optimistic projections. How many schools now? Sarah asked, though she knew the number. 32, Harold replied. With another 15 scheduled this month, Robert sat on Sarah's other side. The governor's office called this morning. They want to discuss implementing the program statewide. Harold's hand tightened on his logbook. That's a lot of schools. It's a lot of children who'll be able to breathe, Sarah said quietly. A young mother passed by, pushing a stroller. She smiled in recognition. Mr. Jenkins, the training at Edison Elementary last week? It saved a kindergartner yesterday. Just like you said it would happen. Harold nodded, making a note in his logbook. Every save got recorded, just like in the park. The list had grown long. Have you visited her? Robert asked after the mother left. Lisa. Harold's pen paused mid-word. Not since we started the program. Been too busy. We could go now, Sarah suggested gently. I'd like to meet her if that's okay. Harold looked at his logbook, then at the spring flowers blooming nearby. Maybe it is time. The drive to the cemetery was quiet. Harold sat in the back of Robert's car, watching the city pass by. His medical kit rested on his lap. 20 years of habit didn't break easily. The cemetery was peaceful, well-maintained. Harold led them through the paths with the certainty of someone who had walked them countless times before. They stopped at a simple headstone under a flowering dogwood tree. Lisa Jenkins' beloved daughter, her dream was to help others breathe. Sarah knelt and placed the flowers they'd bought on the way. "Hi, Lisa. I'm Sarah. Your dad saved my life." Harold's throat tightened. Robert's hand came to rest on his shoulder, steady and supportive. "He's saving lots of lives now," Sarah continued, "teaching people how to help kids breathe. Just like you wanted to do." Harold pulled out his logbook, not the current one, but an older one from his medical kit. "I've been keeping track, Lisa. 17 in the park, 143 through the school program so far. Each one of them got to go home, breathing easy." Robert squeezed his shoulder. "And thousands more will be protected because of what you started." "Because of her," Harold corrected. "Everything I've done, it all started here." Sarah stood, brushing grass from her knees. "Can I show her my breathing technique? The one you taught me?" Harold nodded, unable to speak. Sarah demonstrated the careful breathing pattern Harold had taught her in the park. In through the nose, out through the mouth. Stay calm. Trust the medicine. Focus on each breath. Your dad's really good at teaching it. A warm spring breeze rustled the dogwood blossoms, sending white petals drifting over the headstone. Harold opened his current logbook and made an entry. "Visited Lisa today. Showed her how her dream grew bigger than we ever imagined. The governor wants to name the program after her," Robert said quietly. "The Lisa Jenkins School Breathing Initiative. If you approve." Harold traced the letters on the headstone. "She'd probably say it needs a catchier name. She was always better with words than me." "I like it," Sarah said. "It tells people where it came from, why it matters so much." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the petals dance on the breeze. Finally, Harold spoke again, his voice rough with emotion. "You know what she used to say? Daddy, everybody deserves to breathe easy. 7 years old. And she already understood what took me decades to learn." "She was right," Robert said. "Yeah." Harold closed his logbook. "Yeah, she was." As they walked back to the car, Sarah took Harold's hand. "Will you still sit on your bench sometimes? Even with all the schools to train. Some habits you don't break, remember?" Harold smiled slightly. "Besides, Tommy would miss me." Robert chuckled. "The whole park would miss you. You're part of its heartbeat now." "Speaking of heartbeats," Harold said, his paramedic's instincts kicking in, "how's your breathing been, Sarah? Any tightness in the mornings?" "Nope. I do my exercises every day. And I taught them to my friend Emma too." Harold nodded approvingly. "Teaching others what you've learned. That's how knowledge grows." They reached the car, but before getting in, Harold turned for one last look at the dogwood tree. The white petals were still falling, dancing on the spring air like gentle breaths. "You ready?" Robert asked. Harold touched his medical kit, feeling the weight of both logbooks inside. "Yeah, we got work to do. More people to teach about breathing." As they drove back toward the park, Harold watched the city scroll past. Somewhere out there, a child was breathing easier because of a lesson learned, a technique shared, a spare inhaler mounted on a school wall. And somewhere he liked to think Lisa was smiling. The work wasn't finished, might never be finished, but that was okay. Each breath helped, each lesson shared, each life touched. One breath at a time, one school at a time, one child at a time, just like Lisa would have wanted. 1 year to the day after Sarah's asthma attack, Central Park filled with people gathered around Harold's bench. What had started as a simple ceremony to mark the program's success had grown into something larger, a celebration of life, breath, and the power of caring. Today, Robertson addressed the crowd. "We celebrate not just numbers, though those are impressive enough. 500 schools, over 1,000 saves, but we celebrate something more fundamental, the idea that everyone deserves to breathe easy." Harold sat on his bench, uncomfortable in the new suit Sarah had insisted on buying him. His medical kit still hung at his side. Some things never changed. Tommy had closed his hot dog stand to join the crowd, and Officer Martinez stood nearby with his daughter. "Most of you know how this started," Robert continued. "A chance encounter in this park. A retired paramedic who never stopped caring. A spare inhaler that saved my daughter's life." He paused, gathering himself. "But what you might not know is the story behind the story." Sarah, standing beside her father, squeezed Harold's hand. 20 years ago, A little girl named Lisa Jenkins had a dream of helping people breathe better. She never got to realize that dream herself, but through her father's dedication, that dream has grown beyond anything she could have imagined. Harold's hand tightened on his logbook, a new one, its pages already filling with names and dates. The Lisa Jenkins School Breathing Initiative is now being adopted by 3 other states, Robert announced. By this time next year, over 2,000 schools will have emergency inhalers and trained staff. But more importantly, they'll have something else, the knowledge that someone cared enough to make sure they could breathe. A young girl raised her hand from the crowd. Mr. Jenkins? I'm Emma from Roosevelt Middle School. You saved me last month when I had an attack during gym class. Harold nodded, remembering. You did great, Emma. Stayed calm, just like we practiced. Can I? Emma stepped forward. Can I show everyone the breathing technique you taught us? Sarah jumped up. I'll help demonstrate. The 2 girls stood before the crowd, demonstrating the careful breathing pattern Harold had refined over years of experience. In through the nose, they recited together. Out through the mouth. Stay calm. Trust the medicine. Focus on each breath. More children joined them, each one touched by the program in some way. Soon, a dozen young voices were chanting the breathing pattern in unison. Anna Chun, watching from beside Robert, wiped tears from her eyes. This, Robert said softly into the microphone, this is Lisa's legacy. Not just the inhalers on the walls or the training manuals in the schools, but this knowledge passed from person to person, breath by breath. Harold opened his logbook, adding a new entry, 1-year anniversary. Emma demonstrated breathing technique. Lisa would have loved teaching alongside her. The ceremony continued with presentations from school administrators, health officials, and even the mayor. But Harold's attention kept returning to the children, still practicing their breathing exercises in a corner of the gathering. Mr. Jenkins? A reporter approached. Could you tell us what's next for the program? Harold looked at Sarah, who smiled encouragingly. We keep going. Keep teaching. Keep helping people breathe. One school at a time, one child at a time. Any plans to retire from your park bench? Some habits you don't break, Harold said, patting his medical kit. Besides, you never know when someone might need help breathing. As the crowd began to disperse, Sarah sat beside him on the bench. You know what I realized, Mr. Jenkins? What's that? That day when I couldn't breathe, you didn't just save my life. You showed my dad how to really see me, how to listen. Robert, overhearing, joined them. She's right. I was so focused on what I wanted for her. I couldn't hear what she was trying to tell me. Sometimes, Harold said, watching Emma and her friends still practicing their breathing, the most important lessons come when we least expect them. A young mother hurried past, then stopped and turned back. Mr. Jenkins? The training at my son's school last week. Thank you. Just thank you. Harold nodded, making another entry in his logbook. Each thank you, each success story, each child breathing easier, they all got recorded. For Lisa. Dad? Sarah said, can we get ice cream? To celebrate? Robert looked at Harold. What do you say, partner? Ice cream break. Harold stood, straightening his new suit jacket. Lead the way. But then I need to get back to my bench. It's almost school letting out time. As they walked through the park, Harold noticed how many people nodded in recognition, how many children waved. His worn bench had become more than just a seat. It had become a symbol of hope, of help freely given, of the difference one person could make. You know what Lisa would say about all this? He said suddenly. Sarah and Robert looked at him expectantly. She'd say, see, Daddy? Everybody can breathe easy now. Harold's voice caught slightly. And she'd be right. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the path ahead. Somewhere in the distance, a child laughed, a clear, unfettered sound full of air and joy in life. Harold touched his medical kit, feeling the familiar weight of his logbooks inside. The old one with 17 names from the park, the newer ones filled with hundreds more from the schools. Each name a breath preserved, a life touched, a promise kept. Ready for tomorrow's school training? Robert asked as they reached the ice cream cart. Harold smiled, watching Sarah demonstrate proper breathing technique to yet another curious child. Always ready, he said. Always ready to help people breathe. And in the gentle spring air, in the laughter of children playing, in the steady rhythm of breath after breath after breath, Lisa's dream lived on. One school at a time, one child at a time, one breath at a time, forever.